All right. I will say hello and welcome back to another episode of All About Balance. And today we are joined by none other than Rachel Millar from Safer Places. Rachel, how's it going?
Hiya, yeah, good, thank you. You?
Yes, well, thank you. Yes. So I guess to preface this entire conversation, this sort of came about because from Luke Trainer on Instagram, I saw that he was doing some charity stuff for you guys. He decided to ride 100 miles in a day or something ludicrous like that, and managed to raise a really good amount of money. And I thought, what could I do that could maybe raise some money for you guys? So as you can see from the video, I decided to shave my hair off. Now, this is actually, as a poignant point, this is actually the first podcast I've done since having no hair. And I kind of wanted it to be that way. I thought that was cool. But yeah, so I obviously got in touch with you guys and you were gracious enough to give me some time to sort of discuss safer places and what you guys do, right?
Yeah, well, we're obviously thrilled to be here and that you've done such an amazing thing for us. It's great.
Well, look, I mean, I think we'll obviously get into safer places and whatever else, but I think I think the whole charity thing and the giving and raising money and all this stuff, like it's kind of I feel anyway like it's on the periphery of everyone's kind of mind, but especially during these sort of the last year or so, it's been I feel that it's been really difficult for people to look outside of their own sort of circumstances, like I guess, because obviously there's furlough and there's everything else, and money is sort of tight for everyone. But I just thought, you know, why not, right? Why not?
Yeah, no, it's amazing. And actually, surprisingly, although, as you say, people are going through really difficult times, as we all are, and that COVID has obviously had a big financial impact for a lot of people. The community spirit that we've seen in people turning up saying that we haven't got much money, but what can we do? What do you need? We've seen a real rise in that, and that's amazing for people to know that we're there, to know what we're doing, and to want to be a part of that. And to bring the community into our services has been absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, and I actually think that's probably about right. That sounds logical to me, that in times of hardship the communities band together and there becomes more of a share of resource rather than financial resource, but tangible resource. And you touched on the services and stuff. Do you want to just tell people what Safer Places is and what you guys do?
Yeah, so Safer Places, we're a domestic abuse charity. We work across Essex and Hertfordshire. Predominantly in Hertfordshire, our services are community based. So we do a lot of outreach work in the community, supporting people impacted by domestic abuse. And then we have a lot of accommodation across Essex and Hertfordshire. So for people living in abusive relationships at that point where they need to flee for their safety, then we provide safe accommodation and support within that accommodation as well. So we do a lot of other project services. We have one of the largest stalking advocacy support services in the country. I think it is the largest one in the country. So that's something that we're really proud of, being able to offer support to victims of stalking, because that has an absolutely devastating impact, as does domestic abuse. So yeah, we're trying to make sure that everybody is able to live a life free from abuse and fear.
I mean, I'm not even sure where to go from there, to be honest. It's I was talking to my missus about it, and just how I understand this is almost too naive to say, but it feels silly that safer places should even exist. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. You think it's 2021.
Mm.
How is it that so many people are still impacted by domestic abuse? But we are, if you think about just when support services began, we're still really quite early on in that journey. If you look at how domestic abuse was perceived in society, linking that to feminism and how women have been treated, especially, in terms of the legal system. Um, we touch on it. We offer a lot of training at Safe Places, and we look at the history of legislation and how, women weren't allowed to use a credit card unless they had permission from their husband. Women were historically property of men. That's just the way the law was. They had no rights to their children, no rights to their bodies, no rights to their wages. So I suppose if you look at it in that context, it's unsurprising that it's taken quite a long time for things to move on. But it's only in the domestic abuse bill, which is currently in Parliament, it's only that bill that's going to make it a legal duty for local authorities to even provide support to victims of domestic abuse, because at the moment it's not something that has to happen. Some councils choose to commission domestic abuse services, and we're really lucky in the areas that we work in that we are fairly well funded compared to the sector normal. But yeah, it's not even a must at the moment without that bill that services would even exist, which is why it's so great that we do get involved with communities, because there is a massive charity element and some of our services aren't funded.
Okay, so that doesn't make any sense to me. So we're saying that at the moment, there's no legislation across the country that determines that if somebody is a victim of domestic abuse, that they would be supported.
Yes, in terms
Jesus
of a
Christ.
domestic abuse support service, yeah. So there is legislation out there to protect people impacted by
Yeah, yeah,
domestic
sure, sure,
abuse.
sure.
So you've got the homelessness legislation, you've got non-molestation orders, restraining orders. Obviously, you've got the criminal justice system,
Mhm.
in terms of going through a criminal process. But in terms of the local authorities having a legal obligation to provide emotional and practical support,
Yeah,
the domestic abuse bill is the piece of legislation that will bring that into effect.
yeah, that's nuts to me. Yeah,
Yeah,
it
it is
seems,
nuts. Refuge is
yeah,
charity and it shouldn't be, right?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, this obviously spans far wider than just domestic abuse for people that are homeless, for instance, people that are insolvent, people that have suffered various other tragedies in life. They're almost. It feels ludicrous that there isn't remedies in place that are legislature based, but specifically for domestic abuse. I mean, it feels I understand everything that you've said about the way that the law has been shaped predominantly in the UK and historically, but it feels that if you're going to make domestic abuse a criminal action, then surely it would make logical sense that you must rehabilitate the person that is a victim of that abuse. There's all this stuff about rehabilitation in prison. So if you were accused and convicted of domestic abuse, you go to prison to be rehabilitated. But we're saying that the victims are just what, left? Like, how does that make any sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose that's one of the reasons that we exist as a charity, is to
Yeah.
make sure that people aren't left with that experience, because trauma, and I'll speak about it in terms of trauma because that's
Mhm.
how we view it. It is a traumatic
Absolutely. Yeah.
experience, no doubt about that. And trauma has a profound effect on you.
Mhm.
There's a lot of research out there, and Safer Places has been in existence since the 70s. So we've been working for, we have a lot of experience in responding to people's experiences of trauma, and especially in relation to domestic and sexual abuse and stalking. And that trauma is profound. It has impacts on your mental health, your well-being. It has impacts on your physical health. Um, on people's education, their ability to attend work, school, college. It impacts absolutely everything, and it has a real radiating impact as well. So it's not just the person living with that abuse, it's the people around them, their work environment. It just spans across everything. So, yeah, I mean, your point's really well made. It is crazy that it's not the law that these services are in place to respond to that trauma, but the domestic abuse bill is starting to counter that. At the moment, the duty will bring in a duty to accommodate. So for refuge services, which is really welcome, but there is a lot of campaigning going on at the moment to say that it should be for community services as well, and for services for children as well, because the bill was the first time that children have been recognised as victims of domestic abuse. Previously, they were kind of spoken about in the context of witnessing abuse, so seeing it, but not really. It doesn't really do justice to the experience of a child living in that kind of environment or experiencing that.
So I think I've just realised that we sort of dived into this thing without really referencing or making any definitions. Like, could you just define to me what domestic abuse is? Now I know that's a really difficult thing to do because it's so wide arching, but if you could attempt to sum it up.
Yep, so it's an incident or a pattern of incidents perpetrated by a family member, a partner, ex-partner, somebody that's in a domestic relationship with you, um, that makes you feel um, frightened, or there are a few different areas. So it could be physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, psychological abuse, so controlling, coercive behavior, financial, economic, material abuse, so depriving you of your finances, access to benefits, controlling your finances in some way, or material deprivation, withholding medication or withholding clothing or things like that. So it can cover lots of different forms of
Mm.
abuse, but it's any kind of abuse that's perpetrated by somebody that has a close relationship to you. I haven't given you the official government definition off by heart because that's quite wordy,
Sure.
but that is available and it's on our website. So there is a really detailed breakdown of what that looks like.
Sure. And I mean, I just thought it was important to say that because we've gone 15% into a conversation, excuse me, and we haven't even set a definition. But yeah, so that's really helpful. I think the second question I had was around sort of, and again, this is probably a difficult one, but like where, especially in 2021 or 2020 or whatever, like what do you find the roots of domestic abuse to be? Like how does it sort of come about, do you think?
I think you're right, it's a really difficult question to answer. And I think it's a question that a lot of people ask us as well, people that
Mm,
are experiencing domestic abuse, often, why is this happening? What is the cause of this? Um, in terms of the research that's been done to answer that question, there are loads of different theories out there. Dating back quite far, you've got criminologists saying that it's to do with the shape of the brain. So, some theories are quite out there. You've got quite scientific
sure.
based theories. Others, proposing this intergenerational transmission of violence, but that's really, it might be true for some people that if they've experienced that in their home life that they may go on to perpetrate abuse, but that's not absolutely not true for everybody. It could be a factor that shapes a person, but it absolutely doesn't determine what that looks like. So a lot of the theories have been, they all have their pros and they all have their cons. You could see how it might fit for one person, but not fit for another. Um, a lot of, I suppose, the myths that are out there are that alcohol or drugs can cause abuse, which they don't tend to. They might exacerbate it, they might make it worse, but they definitely wouldn't cause it. And the way that I kind of try and explain that for people, especially that have experienced abuse, is that if that person, goes out and gets really, really drunk, they manage to contain that violence, that abuse. They're not doing that to anyone else on the street. They're not doing it to the bartender. They're not doing it to other people in their club. They've managed to hold on to that very tightly until they get home, and then it's all focused on one person. So actually, even when they're really inebriated, they're completely in control of their actions, and that abuse is, just focused on one person in that domestic setting. So I think, that is one of the biggest myths about the causation of domestic abuse. But really, there isn't a clear answer, which is probably why there isn't a clear intervention for people that perpetrate abuse. There are lots of different things out there that work for different people, and it really just depends on the individual person, about their psychology, their genetics. You know, for some people it can be brain injury that does have an impact on their behavior. So
Absolutely.
yeah, massive question.
Yeah.
Lots of different theories out there, lots of different pros and cons, but it really does depend on the individual, I think.
Yeah. And I mean, it feels to me that the root of everything is trauma of some fashion. Now, okay, trauma is a word that can be, you know, it's a sort of a one size fits all, but it feels like, you know, I mean, you touched on it there, which was my theory, which was that if somebody has seen violence or been a victim of violence in the past, then they may be more um, inclined to output violence, right? A lot of humans are a result of their environments, but then, you know, the word environment has millions of variables attached to it. So, you know, but you're right, you know, brain injury and everything else is probably a massive factor. And I think that's probably, as you say, one of the really difficult things is it's very hard to tackle something that you can't define, you know. So if somebody says to you, you know, whether it be me or a victim of abuse is, you know, well, why is this happening to me, or why is this happening full stop? It's really disheartening, I suspect, if you just turn around and say, well, I don't know, frankly, you know. And as you say, there's theories and there's notions, and you know, maybe some instances are easier to diagnose than others, but if there isn't a sort of an absolute scientific ruling that we can say, well, it's this, or it's this, or it's this, and we can apply that scientifically, that I think becomes very difficult to support, right?
Yeah, it can be difficult because I think, as you know, it's just human nature, isn't it? You want to understand why something's happened, and it's part of our response to trauma that we want to understand exactly, because we want to convince ourselves that we're in control and that we're not going to be in that position again. So quite often, you know, we want to understand things, we want to put a reason on it so we can avoid that happening in the future. Which is why we don't really focus on perpetrators too much in our support whatsoever.
Makes
It's not
sense.
about why somebody chose to use abuse. It's not about them. It's about who we're supporting.
Mm.
And with that person, it's how are they feeling? Let's try and make sense of how they're feeling. Because often people come to us and they might, you know, be blaming themselves for what happened. They might believe that it's their fault, it's because of something they did that caused the abuse. They might think that, you know, they might have a lot of fears about how people are going to respond to them, how authorities might respond to them. So for us, it's very much about trying to make sense of that reaction, because any reaction to abuse is completely normal. It's incredibly traumatic. We all respond differently. Um, but we can put some science behind that. There are reasons why we behave the way we do. So we normalize that. We, you know, give people emotional support to understand that. We give a lot of practical support to navigate all the systems that you're thrown into. When sometimes you are a victim of this, you might be thrown into the criminal justice system. You might suddenly have a lot of different agencies contacting you. You know, you might have social care, you might have housing, and they all come with, you know, there's bureaucracy you have to kind of tread through. Even if it's just applying for benefits, it can be a bit confusing if that's not something you've done before, if you've got a changing housing situation. So we're there to support the person through that, to navigate those systems that they might be thrust into, and provide that emotional support and really focus on them and their future. That is what we're about. So we don't pay too much attention to the perpetrator. It's important that we understand what's happened, but we don't really touch on causation, because we prefer to focus on the person and the present and the future.
Actually, you know, I just thought about how fucking idiotic my question is, really, and it actually it shows how warped the view of domestic abuse is, right? Because predominantly all the questions I've been asking is essentially around the perpetrator, right? When actually you're absolutely right. It doesn't really matter, and it shouldn't really matter. You know what I mean? Like it sort of sees that my narrative is in line with the narrative of the legislation, right? And generally the social view. And that, I mean, that's kind of one of the reasons why you exist as well, because as you say, it should be about the victim and making sure that the victim is rehabilitated properly, right? And as you rightly say, it's the perpetrator. It's good to understand exactly the detail of what's happened, because then you know what you're dealing with, right? But then in the same vein, like it's irrelevant about who or what or why, you know?
It is for us as a support service. I
Yes.
think there's a balance, and it's really important. If we're absolutely the person that's been a victim of abuse, absolutely 100% needs support, and that's
Yeah.
exactly what we're there for.
Yeah.
But if the person who's using that abusive behavior, if they don't have any kind of intervention, if nobody addresses that behavior or tells them that that's wrong, or gives them an alternative, or speaks to them to understand why that's happened, then they'll go on and on and on and on, and we'll have victim after victim after victim after victim. So yeah, it's really important for us that we focus on the victim, and that's, is our priority, because we are a charity for victims of domestic and sexual abuse and stalking. But I think it is really important that we don't lose that focus on addressing that behavior, and because ultimately that's where the accountability for abuse lies, and
Yeah.
somebody should be picking that up. So there are loads of good organizations that work with people who use abusive behavior, and obviously that's what the criminal justice system is there for as well, is to
Mhm.
provide that kind of rehabilitation. So yeah, definitely it's a balance, but I think you're right in that the public perception is very much on the criminal justice response, and about being, hard on abusers, and the victim might get a little bit lost, or I think people just don't know too much about it. And, they don't know how the services work, or, how they're kind of provided, and where the funding comes from, and things like that. I think it's just a little bit unspoken of.
Well, I mean, I guess this is the point of this podcast, right? Like, you know, I I always try and I think one of the reasons why I ask the questions I asked is because I like to fix things, right? That's my job. That's what I do day to day. I fix things. Um, so the reason why I'm asking is like, okay, well, how do we? Because as I say, it's silly that you guys even exist, because if domestic abuse wasn't a thing and stalking wasn't a thing, then and sexual abuse wasn't a thing, then I mean, unfortunately, you'd be out of a job. But you'd be able to go on and do other things. But it does, and I think the point, as you rightly say, and something that we should hammer home, is that the victim shouldn't be lost. It actually should be, balanced, as you say. But I'd say the weighting of the balance should probably be equal, if not slightly more positioned towards the person that's a victim, because, as you say, the person that's using abuse as a mechanism, yes, they may well go on and proliferate that action to more people, but also, as you touched on, the victim isn't just the person who's receiving the abuse firsthand. It's the second, third, fourth, fifth hand people that's rippling out to. And especially when there's children involved, and other family members involved, and extended family, and all this stuff, that it ruins lives, right? So making sure that the source of that first-hand experience is cared for and looked after, I think, is of absolute paramount importance. Absolute
Yeah,
paramount importance.
definitely. And we exist to make people safer as well. Um, the statistic, if you like, is 2 women are killed every week, and that statistic has not changed in like 30 years.
Jesus.
It's not going anywhere. It's still 1 in 4 women that will experience domestic or sexual abuse at some
One in
point in their
four.
lifetime. 1 in 4.
Oh my God.
Yeah, yeah. I have a daughter, and unfortunately, I'm very aware of the fact that she's more likely to be a victim or domestic or sexual assault than she is to get into a top uni.
That's fucking nuts,
These are
isn't it?
very real things that we're dealing
Yeah.
with.
Yeah.
I talk about women predominantly because women are much more impacted by domestic abuse. It is a heavily gendered crime. Most of our victims are female, but I want to be really clear that it absolutely happens to men as well. We support male victims. We have male refugees. we're an open support services. We're really inclusive and recognise that domestic abuse happens in absolutely every community. It doesn't
Sure.
discriminate. And unfortunately, it is something that's really common. It happens to 1 in 6 men, 1 in 4 women.
6.
And I
Jesus.
think, if you think about that, if you think about, just looking around at who you work with, or
Mm.
if you're in school, just how many people, how many children, if you think for one victim, they might have 3 or 4 children, all those children are going to be impacted. The numbers just go on and on and on. And I think everybody is going to know somebody that has been impacted by domestic or sexual abuse
Yeah, I
in
mean,
some way or another.
I could probably think of 5 people in my life. I mean, like just off the top of my head, my sister being one, right? Um, and yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, those stats are staggering, really, and I know that that's kind of the point of them, right? The point of them is to be staggering. And to your point about male inclusion and whatever, I think that is important as well, and maybe we can touch a little bit on that and the stigmas around that. But as you say, it's a heavily weighted uh, situation towards females rather than males, and people can argue, well, the stats are skewed because males don't talk about it and whatever, and maybe there's some truth to that, but to the same point, like how many women do you think have been abused that haven't spoken up? You know?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the, all we have is the research that's out there. And that tells us that, for some women, they experience up to 50 incidents before they call the police.
Yeah, man.
50. And that, can you just imagine that?
Hmm.
50 incidents of abuse before talking to somebody about it.
I think the answer is no. I don't think I can imagine that.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much stigma. There's so many things that influence somebody's decision about whether they want to access help or not. And I think, one of those factors might be not really knowing what support is.
Mm.
We don't exist as an organization to force people to go to the police if they don't want to. We don't ask people to leave the relationship if they don't want to. We completely respect people have their own choices, and people want to decide their own futures. Of course they do. We're not absolutely not there to take that away. I think people impacted by domestic abuse have, they've had their lives controlled for long enough. We're there to empower people, to give them the information that they might need to consider some of those choices, to look at their options, to weigh them. We're there to, discuss that, provide emotional support, and then just be there for them, whatever it is that they decide that they want for their future. Um, yeah.
I think probably if we could speak a little bit about, from a tangible perspective, what safer places can offer, because the words rehabilitation and support and all this kind of stuff, like that makes sense, but what actually is it that you guys can do?
So um, if somebody came to us, we have a number of different services. So
Mhm.
we provide accommodation or outreach support in the community.
Yep.
So all of the people that work for us are they're really highly qualified for the sector. So a lot of us are independent domestic violence advocates, IDVAs for short, and independent sexual violence advocates, ISVAs for short, or independent stalking advocacy specialists. The specialists, which is too much of a mouthful.
I was going to say, good luck
ISAS
trying to say
for
that after a
short.
couple of
Yeah.
drinks.
So we're all we're all qualified. We all have a lot of experience in responding to people that have experienced domestic abuse. So if somebody came and they were living with an abusive partner, they were really frightened. They didn't really know what their options were or what to do, but they're just starting to recognize that this is really, really unsafe now. And they want to talk to somebody, then they could ring us up. Or we get a lot of referrals from the police, sometimes social care, sometimes housing. So lots of different avenues, but people can absolutely just make contact with us themselves. We would talk to that person. We would do what we call a dash risk assessment. So we would ask questions about what was going on in the relationship. We would want to understand, are they frightened? What's happened? Are things getting worse? Are things happening more often? We'd be looking to find out a little bit more about what was going on so we could make an assessment of risk. So then we'd know what kind of options we had available. So if somebody was in, a lot of danger where they were, then we'd say, we've got safe accommodation, you can move in. If somebody is accessing benefits, then housing benefit will cover refuge. Unfortunately, again, this is one of the things that I'm not sure many people know about. Refuge isn't free. So if somebody was in full-time employment, then they would have to pay for that themselves, that accommodation. Um, it's not always covered, but we could offer that, or we could offer different types of safety adjustments to somebody's home. We could apply for a sanctuary scheme, so someone could have an escape room, panic button, things like that. If the risk was high, then we could do those sort of things. If they wanted to report to the police, then we could look at that. We could talk to them about, the process, what court process is. We support people through the court system, so we would be with them. If they wanted us to go with them to the police station, then we would do that. Obviously, COVID has impacted this. Sometimes we do this from a distance with mask
Sure.
on, full PPE, and it has been a little bit of virtual support. But I'm talking, pre-COVID. Generally, what we would do is we would go with them. We would go with them to the court. We'd go to the court beforehand, so they knew exactly what the courtroom looked like, where they were going to be. We'd be with them on the day. We'd be keeping them updated throughout the whole thing. So, being arrested, being charged, going to court. This is the date. This is what's going to happen. This is what the bail conditions mean. If they didn't want to go down that route, then we would explain to them what options they had available to them in terms of civil remedies. So non-molestation orders, occupation orders. We'd look at their housing situation. So if they didn't want to go into refuge, which not everybody does, completely understandable, we would let them know what their options are so they could apply to the local authority under the homelessness legislation. They could be provided with temporary accommodation if they needed to move. There are so many different things that we would look at. It really does depend on what that person was experiencing. But if they felt that they weren't safe, then we would absolutely do something. If they wanted to stay in the relationship, then we would safety plan with them within the home. So we'd have discussions about what to do if they felt. You can often tell when something's going to come. A lot of people describe it to us as walking on eggshells. It goes in a pattern. Domestic abuse is cyclic in nature. I think we could all understand if you went on a first date and got punched in the face, there wouldn't be a second date. It doesn't happen like that. And it's not always every day. There are moments within that relationship that are lovely.
Mm.
Of course there are. Otherwise, you wouldn't enter a relationship with that person. You wouldn't have an intimate relationship. And there are glimpses of that within the relationship as it goes on. You know, that's why so many people choose to stay, because that person they display all of these behaviors that you would want in a relationship. So it's not always all bad. And unfortunately, that's why it's so difficult, because people that use abuse will often make sure that they do that to continue the cycle of control, to make sure that that person stays with them. And often when people leave, that can be a really, really frightening time. And that can be a really dangerous time as well, because if you think the perpetrator has had all of this control and now suddenly that person wants to leave, that can be a really dangerous time. So we can absolutely support somebody with that. And as I say, if they wanted to stay, then we would look at safety measures, what they can do if they feel that there is going to be an instance of abuse. Then we can talk about how to manage that. We are quite not secretive, but we don't obviously talk too much about those safety plans and the detail of that. That's just to protect people that are abiding by those safety plans, because if we were really public and say, oh, do this, this and this, then people that are using abusive behaviors would understand what was happening as well. So some things are dependent on the individual, absolutely. But it's things, like having code words set up and making sure that people know what they can do.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that you raised there that shows just maybe a small layer of complexity to this is that there are generally portions of the relationship that are loving and kind and enjoyable, and you know we portray the perpetrators as, you know, monsters or evil or whatever, and maybe in some cases that's true, right? But they are also capable of everything that's positive, because as you say, if you were to go on a date and somebody abuses you or is physically violent to you, you just wouldn't see them again. You know what I mean?
Exactly. Yeah.
Um, and I think the thing that I find difficult, I mean, I obviously understand these that there's variables to this, and I also understand why, but the how you as a person, how you as an employee, how you as an advocate for domestic sorry, not an advocate for domestic abuse, but geez, that's definitely the wrong way to say it. As an advocate for safer places, like, how do you cope dealing with this? Because, you know, how do you not take this stuff home? Because surely that's impossible.
Um, so as I say, we are all professionally qualified,
Mhm.
and Safer Places as an organisation is incredibly good at making sure that you have the tools to respond to what it is that you're dealing with. Um, so we're very lucky to work for an organisation like that. We do have significant training on trauma and burnout and vicarious trauma. Of course, it can touch. You know, there are been working in the domestic abuse field for about 10 years myself. A lot of that as a frontline practitioner or a manager or senior manager of services, and there are cases that there are faces that I can see. Of course, those cases they do touch you, but you see the positive outcomes that you have, which are amazing, and you are really privileged to walk with these people as through their journey and to see the transformation that they go to. You know, their lives completely change when they leave an abusive relationship and they find themselves and go on to do wonderful things. So yeah, of course there are aspects of it that are, you know, it is difficult to hear, but we're trained for that, we're prepared for that, we have support mechanisms in place. You know, we have wellbeing managers within our senior management team. We have clinical psychologists employed to make sure that there's somewhere to debrief. We're a very supportive team. We're really lucky in the organisation that we work for that we have a lot of supportive things in place for us. But I think most people working in the sector would tell you that overall it's a real privilege. It's a joy to be able to to meet these people, to share their experience and to be with them alongside them on their journey. Um, and even if it isn't somebody that you've supported closely, sometimes it can just be one phone call, but you know that you've made that difference. Um, so when, you know, for example, if we had a referral from the police for a high risk situation and you have a conversation with that person and they don't really want to engage with support, that they're not ready, but you explain what it is, you explain who you are, what we do, and you just say, you know, you could just call me when you're ready. And then 3, 4 years later, that person tracks you down and it's like, right, I'm ready. And then whoosh, off you go. And this person's starting a whole new life. Like you can't, it's so difficult for me to explain just how positive that is and how rewarding that is. The difference that you can make is huge. So I think that's why we all do it, is because there's so much more that needs to be done in the sector. So a lot of institutional advocacy, a lot of campaigning, you know, working, responding to government consultations to say we need this, we need this, we need this, we need more protection. There's more that needs to be done. But at the same time, being able to work at an individual level, you see people's lives change and their children's lives changed, and that outweighs um anything else.
I mean, I think that not only is that really a really, really beautiful way to look at it, but also I think that it shows that there are special people that are working alongside the victims of these situations, and you yourself being one of them. I think that I think it takes a specific type of person to be able to engage in the situations that you do and look at it the way that you do. And you speak about training and this and that and the next thing, and I understand that, and I understand how important that is. But I think at the core, there has to be something more, right? There has to be something more in a person that would allow them to engage in these things the way that you guys do. And as you say, for me specifically, you just said, oh well, you have a conversation with somebody, and then maybe in 3 or 4 years, 3 to 4 years, they'll get in contact with you. We talk about delayed gratification, like that's some serious delayed gratification. But I also, the thing that upsets me, frankly, about just that statement is that person could be living for another 3 or 4 years in an abusive situation. And I say abusive situation, and the images that come to my head are the most extreme versions, obviously, right? That's what's painted. But even the most minor experiences is still a vastly destructive experience, and one that nobody should have to live in for a day, let alone an extra 3 to 4 years before they summon up the energy and the strength to be able to make the move to better themselves. And I do think your point is entirely valid. I'm sure the gratification that you get from seeing somebody completely change their situation and do something that will undoubtedly change their lives for the better has to be so enriching. And that's kind of why I say that there must be vast amounts of special people that work in your sector.
We are really diligent, I suppose, in who joins our team. For us, as I say, we exist to make sure that people live a life free from fear and abuse. So we need to make sure that the people working for us are going to respond to people that are impacted by abuse in the right way. So there are a number of qualities that we look for. Absolutely, people need to be empathic. They need to be able to communicate with people really easily, and to just be non-judgmental and understand everybody's situation, to be inclusive. So they are special, the people that work for us, absolutely. And they do a really good job. I just wanted to touch on what you were saying about that what conjures up in your mind is when you think of abuse is sometimes the most high risk situations. Just want to make it clear that we deal with over like 3,000 people a year, and that's just in Hertfordshire, considering we cover both. And we predominantly deal with high and medium risk cases. A few years ago, we were commissioned to run the IVA service in Essex, and I think at one point we supported 4,000 clients in a year,
Jesus
all
Christ.
of who were high risk. Probably should have given you these definitions a little bit earlier,
I
but
was
when I
literally
talk
going to
about
say,
high
I
risk,
was literally going to say,
I talk about what I mean is somebody that's been risk assessed to be at imminent risk of murder, or from something that they're unlikely to be able to recover from psychologically or physically. So
Jesus.
it's the highest of high. It's
Mhm.
unimaginable, things that you can't describe, things that it just wouldn't be ethical to share. Um, and you're talking about medium abuse. I really hate these terms,
I understand. I
because abuse
understand.
is never medium and abuse is never
I
standard.
understand. I understand.
Um, but medium, that risk of harm, significant harm, or murder is still there. It's just that risk isn't imminent, so it's not going to
Yet.
happen right now.
Mm.
Um, and then for the classes, for the cases that would be classed as standard risk, it's where the risk isn't of murder, um, or one incident of significant harm. I think, who are we to say what harm is and how abuse is going to impact on somebody, which I think is why we have, a few problems. We do use these terms because they're used everywhere, so we have to use them. We have to have this common language, and it's really important that we understand risk and that we're able to differentiate between risk, because if we've got somebody that's about to be murdered and we've got somebody who isn't, then we need to respond differently to those persons. Not that one takes precedence over another, because they don't. People are people, and we will respond to absolutely everybody. We don't have waiting lists in our service, but we will respond differently. We
I
that's
mean,
just matter of fact.
I think it is. I think it's fine to. I mean, maybe it's not fine to the victims, but I think it's fine. I mean, one thing you have to, as you say, you have to classify things, because otherwise it's up for interpretation, and interpretation it then gets messy, right? Um, and I think the other side is I mean, it. I think precedent is the right word, really, because if there's somebody that's of the highest of high risks and there's somebody of the lowest risk, as you say, it doesn't demean or declassify what their emotions are or their emotional value. But, I think even if you went and you asked a person that's of standard, quote unquote, risk, oh, what do you think we should do here? Do you think we should look after you first, or put all of our resource time into you, or put all of our resource time to the highest of high risks? I think even somebody that is a victim of abuse would say, well, we must come together and look after these people. So, I understand why you don't want to use the term precedent, but for me, it seems clear that yes, of course, you're not gonna leave this person on the shelf that has a standard risk, but in the same vein, we must attend to the problems at hand, and the problem that gets fixed first is the hardest. So, I mean, yeah, it makes total sense.
Yeah, I think it's important for us that people know that we're not going to judge their experience in comparison to
Absolutely,
somebody else. So
absolutely.
we deal with a lot of different experiences. No one is the same,
Hmm.
and no one's experience will be the same. And I think that's why it's important for us that, no matter what it is that's going on, if somebody comes to us, they will have a key worker. We'll get in contact, within 24 to 48 hours. We have a helpline available 24/7. We're available. It might be that it's a different response, so you might get a different service. So you might be allocated an IDVA, or an ISAS. If we're talking about high risk stalking, then you might get a different worker who's trained in something quite different. Or it might be that you get community support, or it might be that you get refuge accommodation support, for immediate safety reasons. But the support is the same. The emotional support is the same, because although we talk about risk, it changes. It's dynamic. It's not
Of
static.
course,
It's not
yeah, of
something that sticks.
course.
It changes every second. And um, you know, it could be that somebody is telling you a little bit of information. They want to see what happens before they trust you to tell you a little bit more.
Of course.
These things happen. So for us, it's really important. Everybody gets the same service. It's
Mhm.
person centered. So whatever the experience is, they'll get the response that they want, that they choose. Um, so yeah, I think that's why I've framed it in that way, is because it's just so important for us that everybody is able to access our service, and they're not worried thinking, oh no, don't worry about me, or they're not thinking,
Sure.
oh, this service isn't for me, this is for somebody who um I think so much about domestic abuse focuses on physical abuse,
Mm.
because it's the easiest to understand, right?
It's
You can
tangible, yeah.
see it, it's tangible. Yeah, absolutely. You can understand it easier. Um, Whereas when we're talking about controlling coercive behavior, it's
Jesus.
a little bit more difficult. You can't see it. It's difficult to understand. It's very nuanced. It's difficult to pinpoint and say that it's one thing, because it's not. It's a approach. It's a collection of lots of different behaviors.
Mhm.
Um, so some people don't even recognize their own risk. And, why would they? Because we don't talk about domestic abuse, do we? It's not something that you're taught about in school. It definitely wasn't something that I was taught in terms of, sex ed or relationship, whatever they call it. Um, can remember that awkward classroom situation with the banana, but nobody talks about consent
Yeah.
or what that means or
Mhm.
what to do when you're in a situation and you feel unsafe. You're not taught about those things. So, um, everybody that comes to us, we believe, we listen, and we use our experience to try and understand what's happening for that person and give them the information that they need to make choices about their future.
Yeah, I think that's a much better way of doing it than I've just said. Obviously, right? Obviously, I think that's one of the things. It's actually one of the reasons why I wanted to do this podcast specifically, is because, I one of the reasons why I do this podcast is because I want to have conversations with people smarter than me, right, or more experienced than me, and all that stuff. And so already there's been a multitude of things that you've said that have changed the way that I determine this thing. And I think that there was 2 points that you just made there that I thought were really important. And one is that when people say domestic abuse, essentially what they think about is violence, right? Physical violence. And the reason why you think that is obviously because you could take a picture of it, right, and you can see it, and the ramifications for that are obvious. But then how you pinpoint, and as you just said, how sometimes for mental abuse, the victims don't even know they're being mentally abused necessarily, right? They may think that something's wrong, but they can't pinpoint what it is. And that, I think, is massive, and this is just the domestic abuse side. It's not even the sexual abuse or the stalking side, right? And I that becomes drastically difficult, right? Drastically difficult. I think you're right as well that there is no education. I was just thinking as you were talking, like, I think how excuse me, how did my sister come to the understanding? And I remember it's because the situation, or one of the situations that she went through, she came back and she was like, oh, that didn't feel right, that didn't feel okay. And then I remember she would have had a discussion with whoever, and they'd have been like, no, that's definitely wrong, like that definitely shouldn't happen. And the learning on the job for this kind of stuff is definitely not something that we should be putting our communities through, right? And you know, how how can that change? How can we make that better before people get to safer places?
Yeah, I mean, there are actually lots of things that are going on in terms of improving education in schools, and making sure that there are things that young girls and young males can access in the community.
Mhm.
So there are different projects, but I think it is really dependent on where you live in terms of what's going on in your area and what's commissioned.
Rough.
So I think, the domestic abuse bill really, and I keep banging on about it, but this is the first piece, is the first DA, or it's the first piece of legislation
Mhm.
that is actually going to lay down some foundations of what we must do. Um, so I would say, definitely go and have a look at that, because there are things in there, legislative and non-legislative frameworks that will give us a better way to respond, and intervene earlier so people aren't becoming victims of domestic abuse. And I think the other thing is just awareness, is that to make sure that we talk about it together as communities, and to make sure, that we're checking on people and that we understand what it is, and that we don't, you know, join in with some of those jokes, or that we're not perpetuating or saying that that behavior is okay, that we're calling it out. It's like, oh, that's not right. Um, yeah, it's very nuanced. Domestic abuse as a subject is very big. It's very difficult to talk about everything, and how to overcome it, because it is quite complex and very nuanced in the way that it's come about. But definitely the way that we talk about it, and the domestic abuse bill is going to bring more stuff in. So the community coming together, I think, is one of the most important things, which is why we're so pleased that you've not only decided to do this amazing thing and raise loads of money, which I hope you realise will provide refuge accommodation for a family for 2 months, 3 months. That's amazing. Like, you talk about how special our staff are, in being able to change people's lives. That's you completely making a family safe for months. And you don't get paid to do it, whereas we do. So
Sure.
absolutely amazing. And not only have you done that, but you've also invited us to be part of this, which
Mm,
gives us, access to people that probably wouldn't come into our services or know too much about our services. So it's this kind of stuff which is just amazing in terms of how to stop abuse earlier, because it's just having those conversations and realizing that, we're not, I think there are a lot of stereotypes about domestic abuse support services and what they're like, and um, what kind of people we are, but it is about making sure that we respond to the person at hand. And if people can see that and understand a little bit more about what support is available, then they might be more likely to engage in it. So I would just say thank you to you, because you are part of that. You're part of how we respond to it.
well, I mean, look, I will. I I've had a few people sort of say, "Oh, like, oh, what you've done is great and whatever." But I mean, to be honest, I don't think I can take any accountability of that for myself, and I'll explain why. You know, I started donations off, right, just because if I was gonna do a fundraiser and I didn't put any money in myself, I'd feel very negative about that. So I I put a little bit of money in, but really it was the community that raised the money. It wasn't me. I'm just a person. I'm just a person with not a very large platform. Um, and I just put out an Instagram video saying that I was doing a fundraiser for you guys, and the fundraiser to shave my hair off. What it does show me actually is one, how sort of generous people are for giving money to things, but also how many people wanted me to get rid of my hair. That's what it really showed me. Um, yeah, but yeah, I mean, look, I'm really thankful that people donated, right? Because I understand semi personally the effects that domestic abuse and stalking and sexual abuse can have on people. And as soon as I heard about your charity from Luke, I was determined to do something. I didn't know what exactly, but it was something that I wanted to do. I mean, to raise the money that we have raised, I've doubled the target, which is mind blowing. But I kind of try not to think about it, because if I think about it, I don't know how I feel about it. So at the end of the day, the way I look at it is it's a fantastic cause, and something that I want to continue to support, not just now but in the future. And it was merely me asking the community for some help, and the community responded. I didn't really do anything. So I don't really want to take any accountability at all. If anything, I want to pass all that accountability and all that praise onto the community. Like if this does one thing, if it does one thing that the 2,500 people that watched my video of me saying, hello, I'm going to shave my hair off for safer places. If anything, if 10% of those people decided to go to your website and take a look and just even think about it, right, then that is just as valuable as the money that was raised to me. Um,
Absolutely. Yeah.
and yeah, I mean, yeah, I guess that's kind of my thoughts on that. I only really have one other question, if that's okay.
Hmm.
And I wanted to ask, you've been so incredibly eloquent and so brilliantly thought out in this conversation specifically, and it's kind of, it inspires me to learn more about how to get involved in this sort of stuff. So if anyone has something like me, like, how did you get into this organization? How did you get into this career path?
Um, so personally,
Mhm.
I studied criminology and sociology as an undergraduate degree.
Right,
And whilst I was doing that, I volunteered for victim support,
right,
working with young victims of crime, so any type of crime. Um, yeah, and then when I graduated, I was really fortunate that there was an opening in victim support, so I
okay,
went to work for them um, as a volunteer assistant, I think it was called. So working with other volunteers in the community, so making sure that victims of crime had access to emotional and practical support. And then it was from there really that I um, just went on a 1-day training course about the DASH risk assessment, so domestic abuse, and I was like, that. that is it. That is what I want to do. I found it really difficult to believe that these things were happening. Found that it was really unjust. Like how is this allowed? How are people not doing anything? And I just had to be part of that. Needed to do something. So um, I trained with victim support. I became an independent domestic violence advisor. Then just went into different roles, became an IDVA, senior IDVA, managed the IDVA service. Then I moved to Safer Places, managed accommodation services, worked in different roles, senior management roles. Went on and did a master's in the dynamics of domestic abuse. But these are all things that you don't have to do. That was my path.
Right.
But that just speaks of my experience. We've got people in the organization that came in as like in domestic roles, so like refuge housekeepers, and learned more about domestic abuse. They had these interactions with the clients that are living there, and the same as me, they thought this is something that I want to do. So just then go on different training programs and start to qualify as workers. So there are so many different routes in. We have quite a lot of volunteers that work for us, so doing different bits and bobs. I think that's always a really good way to get involved if you don't have experience of working with people. As I said, we are quite specific about who works with our clients, because we need to be. It's about their safety, and that absolutely the response that we give them has to be perfect. So we provide a lot of training. So whatever career path, it doesn't matter. I think if you're the type of person that wants to support people, you're non-judgmental, you've got a lot of empathy and you want to do it, that's all that you really need. The rest comes. You can get that experience by working alongside us, working alongside people that are already doing the job. And then, as I say, it is just a matter of going through those qualifications and making sure that you're learning about different types of legislation, understanding what options are available, because obviously you're going to have to relay that information to survivors. So as long as you've got the drive and the want, and if you want to make a difference, to us that's the main ingredient really. The rest can come. So it's not a specific, we look for this type of person, because we don't really. It's really important that our service looks like the community that we serve. So a whole range of different people that work for us, but the main thing is just being able to want to make a difference and to want to support people.
And I think that's a really beautiful thing. I understand that I've taken over an hour of your time, so I'll wrap this up. But if you can just finish us off by letting people know how to get into contact with Safer Places if they need to, or if they want to volunteer or whatever else, just what's the best methods for them to get in contact with you guys?
So probably if you want to get in contact with the office, or if you want to get in contact about volunteering, then our website absolutely is the best place to go. If somebody was in a abusive relationship, or they were worried about somebody that was and they wanted to speak to us, again, the website has a lot of stuff on there. It has a lot of information for people that are worried about somebody. It's got our telephone numbers on there. That's 24/7. Anybody can ring us and ask for advice and support. We support in Essex and Hertfordshire when we're not a national organisation, but we can, if someone rang us, we'd always signpost them to where they needed to go. We've got a live chat on there. So for people that, especially the way things are at the moment with the restrictions that are in place, if somebody felt that it wasn't safe for them to pick up the phone, there's a lot of information about safety on our website, and we've got the live chat on there, which is open office hours during the week, but over the weekend it's open 24/7. So if it has to be 2 o'clock in the morning, if that's when that person needs a response, that's when we'll respond. And our telephone number's on the website as well.
Beautiful.
I can read it out for you.
Sure. I mean, look, if you read it out just now, and then I'll put all the website and everything else in the show notes so people can get to it. That's fine.
Yep. So it's 03301 025 811.
Perfect. Well, look, I mean, I don't really think I can thank you enough. I mean, we definitely have to do this again, because I think there's a lot of content in there that I'd like to go a little bit further into, right? And maybe when we've got a little bit more time, we can do that. But from me specifically, I just want to thank you for all of the work that you have done up to this point, and for everything that Safer Places and other organisations are doing. Frankly, if anyone has got to this point, you'll realise just how complex and important the cause that you're working towards is. And I'll reiterate my statement that I think that the people that are involved in the cause that you guys are working towards are incredibly special people, and I think that you should be incredibly proud of yourself, specifically for just being the person that you are. Really, I think it's amazing, absolutely amazing.
That's very kind. We're not very good at taking thanks either. I think the strength and where the thank you is needed is absolutely not from us. We're there to give people the information that they need. The survivors that we support are, they're the people that are, wow. They're living it, they're experiencing it, they're overcoming it. We exist for them. And I just want to say again, thank you to you, and to the people, as you rightly say, that have donated from the community. But
Yeah.
I suppose it'd be nice to end on the fact that without you, they wouldn't have necessarily known about us. They might not know what we have offered. And again, those funds are going to make a fundamental difference. You could have saved a life, that refuge space being funded.
Look, I'm equally as poor as you at taking thanks, so we could spend the next 50 minutes just passing thanks between each other. But I think what you've just said there is actually the really important point, and that's that the money raised, regardless of who and what it came by, can potentially save a life, right? And I think if nothing else, that's the important thing to take away from this.
Absolutely.
Cool. Well, look, thank you so much for your time, and I hope
Thanks
to
for
speak to you
having
soon.
me. All right, cheers.